Well, hello and welcome back for another webinar brought to you by Foster Adopt Connect. My name is Derek Williams with the Northwest Missouri office, and I'm a foster adoptive parent myself. And today I'll be playing the role of audience participant as we welcome our special presenter today, Miss Renee McCrary. Renee, how are you doing?
I'm good this morning. Thank you, Derek.
Great. All right. Well, if you can kind of tell everybody a little bit about yourself, and we'll get right into it.
Yeah, so my name's Renee, and I'm the Director of Counseling Services at MOXA in Kansas City. And one of the most exciting projects we've been working on over the last 5 years or so is developing a program for youth with sexual behavior problems. And that's what I'll be talking with you all about today.
All right. And it is such a tricky topic to address. So as we go through, I will jump in with any question I think that a young new foster parent might have, and I'll let you take it away, okay?
All right. Thank you, Derek. So one of the things that when we very first started doing this program, and one of the things that interested us in doing this program is that oftentimes when children act out in a sexual way, historically anyway, they were thought to be adult sex offenders, or people use the words little perps or other kinds of negative in adults words to describe their behavior. So one of the things that we know is that little kids, and not necessarily little kids, but children, youth, up to ages 17 or so, when they act out sexually, it really is a very different psychological experience than when people 18, just to use an arbitrary number, 18 and older act out. So a child who acts out sexually is very unlikely to actually ever act out again. And a teenager or older youth who acts out sexually again, I think the statistics at this point are about 2% will act out. And one of the questions, act out again as an adult. And one of the questions that I always have is, if you had a general population, a group of 100 kids that had not acted out sexually, I wonder what the percentage of those kids would act out sexually as adults. So I think the important piece about this particular slide and that historical piece is beginning to see these kids as kids. And really seeing these kids and the issue of sexual behavior or sexual acting out not really as a juvenile justice problem, but more as a mental health problem. And Jane Solofsky, who's one of the biggest researchers in the area of youth with sexual behavior problems, those are words that she used, that this is not a juvenile justice issue, this is a mental health issue. So,
Renee, I do have a quick question.
Yeah.
So, it's fairly normal for kids to, for lack of a better way of saying it, play doctor,
sure.
Or something like that. And
yeah.
You're not suggesting that that's a mental health issue. That's more of a learning thing.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the things that we know for sure, and I think one of the biggest challenges we have here at MOXA is trying to sort that out. When is it this just a sexual play that's a really typical, natural, normal part of growing up? And when does it cross the line? And so here are I've got a couple of tips that are simple that people can remember. So one is, have I tried to redirect this child? So have I said, hey, Jimmy, let's not do that. Why don't you go over there and play some video games? And then Jimmy played a video game while I was watching, but then immediately, as soon as he thought I wasn't watching, went back to engage again in the sexual behavior. So, is the child redirectable? That's a really important piece. Does the child appear to be planning? So this behavior happens when, let's say as a mom, I go to church every Wednesday night, and so the behavior happens on that Wednesday night when I'm gone. So that can be as a result of just, lack of supervision, but maybe the child has planned to act out during that time, and that's a problematic element when a child has planned. Is there coercion involved? So did the child say to the other child, I won't like you, I won't be your friend, I'll tell other people this, that, or the other thing that's negative about you. You can have this candy, I'll give you my allowance. I could go on and on about all the different kinds of coercive comments we've heard that kids have made. So that's problematic, as opposed to when two kids just kind of run into each other and then get engaged. They're in the middle of playing a different game or doing some other stuff, and then they just kind of, I would almost say naturally fall in to some sexual exploration or curiosity with each other. That is, like you said, a very common thing. So a couple other quick things. One is that we look at is, are the kids around the same age and around the same developmental level, and or is one significantly older, or does one have a disability that puts them at a disadvantage? And then finally, is the child kind of preoccupied with acting out sexually? Did this just happen kind of spontaneously, or does the child seem to really be engaged in some preoccupation about sexual matters? And we're actually seeing an increase in that. If kids have increased access to pornography on the internet. So that preoccupation is something that we pay attention to.
So,
yeah.
For me, for lack of a better way of saying it, I think a lot of kids, it's I'll show you mine if you show me yours.
Mm-hmm.
Is that coercion?
Oh, that's a great. I've never heard that question, and I've been doing talks about this for a long time. It's a great question. I guess it sort of is, but it's also, I think maybe there would need to be some other power dynamics with that would make it problematic. So if I'm a 13-year-old boy or girl, it doesn't matter. If I'm 13 years old and I'm talking with an 8-year-old, and I say, I'll show you yours, or mine if you show you yours. So that would be because of the age difference.
Right.
I also look at other things like size, intellectual capacity, kind of just natural power, popularity. There are certain kids that just that pull a lot of weight. They might be 8 or 9 years old, but they're already considered to be kind of the cool kid on the block, So are they using that power over someone? Although ordinarily kids that act out sexually are kids who kind of have some social struggles already. That's what we generally see. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we'll go on to the next slide.
Okay, great. So we were really excited last year in August after a lot of work from the governor's task force that was put together on child abuse, and then there was a special group working on youth with sexual issues around supporting youth with sexual behavior problems. So in the state of Missouri, prior to this law being passed, if I'm trying to say this in a way that's easy to understand. So if a child that was older, so a common story we would hear would be a 13-year-old, for instance, who was acting out on the neighbor kids during the time that they were playing outside. And maybe it was pretty ongoing, and we'd hear about this from different neighbor kids. But if we would call it into the children's division, they would not be able to respond to that call because the child didn't have any care, custody, or control over the other child. So the children's division was not able to act on those calls because they weren't stipulated to do that. So now, and as of August of 15, the Children's Division has been empowered to respond to those calls. So if a child, and I shouldn't say empowered, there's a legal element that enabled them to do this. Now, if they receive a call where the older kid doesn't have care, custody, and control, they do follow up on that and do an assessment. And so then they support the families where both the victim child has been acted out upon. They can provide some support to those victims, and they can provide some support to the older child who has been acting out in terms of making some referrals to different kinds of agencies that might be helpful. So Anyway, we were just really excited about that, and it's really made a big difference for the youth in the state of Missouri. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was just an enormous number of calls that the state of Missouri received within the first month that that law had changed.
Yeah, unfortunately, in foster homes, I would say, I'm totally guessing here, but you may know, percentages may be a little higher of these type behaviors.
Yeah, it definitely, I don't know the percentages on that, but definitely I would say that it's higher. You know, the kids, one of the things we know that kind of causes sexual acting out is the experience of trauma and just being removed from your parents' care, even if your parents are not being able to care for you very well at the time. Just making that change for a child can be considered pretty traumatic. And so they're just trying to make sense of the world, and when the world doesn't make very much sense, and they can definitely be more prone to acting out sexually. One of the reasons also that kids act out sexually is for comfort. One of the stories I remember when I was first learning about doing this work was a story of 3 little children who were not in foster care. They were in their biological home of their biological parent, who may have been like substance abusing or some factor that was interfering in their ability to parent. And these 3 little children would have to sleep together in the same bed, and they began to touch each other on their private parts in order just to comfort each other and for nurturing. So we're all looking for warm interactions with other people, and so yeah, I think you're right. I think it does happen with an increasing more significantly when a child is placed in foster care than it does when they're in the biological care of their biological parents. And I want to say that's one of the reasons we're really excited. Moxie is really excited to be working with Foster and Adopt and Connect to bring this information to foster parents.
Absolutely. All right.
So we've kind of talked about this already, but it's a nice list. What is harmful sexual behavior? And I think the list is pretty self-explanatory. I've already talked about the last element that's listed here, which is if coercion is used, and when there are differences in the children's level of development. Certainly going back up to the very first one, when it puts a child at risk. Violates the rules, self-abusive, and self-abusive is when kids are just hurting themselves in some way, and especially on their private parts. If the child says it's a problem, oftentimes the kids are the ones that they have a great awareness of what they're doing that is difficult. So also if it makes other people uncomfortable, that's just a problem, and when it's occurring at the wrong place or time. So, do you have any questions about that slide, Derek?
Well, okay, yes.
Great.
What happens when you have 2 kids who are way too young for sexual behaviors, say 2 7 or 8 year olds, and they're not necessarily uncomfortable, either one of them, with what's happening? It's still a harmful sexual behavior, but
yeah,
you understand what I'm saying?
I know exactly what you're saying. Do you care if I pull up? I'm going to move ahead just a little tiny bit and pull up this slide. It's my favorite one.
Okay.
So these are the 5 sexual behavior rules that we teach all the kids and the families. So just like most families have rules, I remember when my boys were growing up, we had rules about like no balls in the house.
Right.
You can't throw balls in it. So every family has simple rules that everybody knows for a fact. You can't do this or that. So we really encourage families, not just foster families, but all families, and especially families where some sexual behavior problems have happened or are prone to happen, to also institute these sexual behavior rules, because what you just said, like 5, 6, or 7 year olds that are looking at each other and maybe sort of cooperatively, they're both interested in that or touching each other, then it doesn't, and it's not including any coercion, nobody's being hurt. Like, how do you talk about that? Well, that would be against the sexual behavior rule. So for kids, it's not okay for them to show their private parts to other people. It's not okay for them to look at other people's private parts or to touch each other's private parts. It is okay to touch your private parts as long as you're in private and don't take too much time. And it's not okay to use sexual language or make other people feel uncomfortable with sexual gestures. So those are just kind of, we find those helpful actually, even in determining sometimes. It's like, oh, wait a minute, we'll hear things like that, Derek, that we think, well, I don't know, that's not, like that. What's wrong with that? Well, it's against the sexual behavior rule. So,
Gotcha.
And it kind of makes sense, but how do you talk about it with kids? Well, it's just not okay.
Well, okay. So this is another tricky one, and I can remember as a child, I had some friends across the street who I couldn't just go knock on the door. I had to call because their parents had a tendency to walk around a lot not wearing very much. And so in their house, like nudity and whatever really was not, it was just kind of a way of life. Nobody really thought much of it. So that becomes tricky for kids to navigate in a situation like that. Yeah,
it is tricky. And while, different families have different values around that, like you said, you were the outsider in that situation. And so I think it's important for families to kind of manage their own cultures also so that they're respectful of other people's cultures.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Well, the good news was that they just made that hey, call. Call before you come over. So 7-year-old me caught on, oh, okay, I got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
then, well, like now, as a dad, my daughter is now 6, and so she is into taking baths because she'll take a bath and watch Netflix on the iPad.
Wow.
That's
luxurious.
Yeah, she has a very hard life. But our bathtub is really deep, and it has a rock, facade on it. And so it makes us a little nervous for her to go in by herself. So usually her mom does it, but, if her mom's on call or something and I'm the only one there and she needs to bathe, then I have to do it. And so it's tricky now. I'm trying to help figure out a way to help her understand. Like I try to avoid seeing her ever without her clothes on, but in that situation I don't have much choice.
Sure.
So it's kind of a tricky thing to navigate, to model for kids, I think. And for a lot of foster parents, you're kind of told, if they're older, you won't see them naked or you shouldn't see them naked or whatever. But then sometimes things happen where kids have physical issues. My son had bowel issues when he was little. And that's, some of that becomes really tricky to try to navigate, especially, I think, for foster parents.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, I think about number 4, it is okay to touch your private parts as long as you're in private and you don't take too much time. And, that's a lot about cleanliness, just keeping yourself clean. And sometimes for a variety of different reasons, kids need help with that from their caregivers. And I think what's important, just kind of changing the topic for just a second, is for parents, foster parents especially, to kind of name it, and it's important for you to be clean, and we want other kids to want to play with you, and that kind of thing, and letting them know. And pretty soon, hopefully not in all situations, but many situations, I'm going to teach you how to do this yourself, and you can do this yourself, and we want you to be safe and that kind of thing. So, and if they say, hey, I don't want you to do this, that then, and I'm not talking about a 2-year-old that's tantruming, but then we navigate with that with them and say, okay, well, so maybe you'd like to do this yourself, and let's walk through the steps of what you'll need to do, So just that consent piece, listening to them. And
I've been trying to, talk her through, okay, well, I'll start the tub, but you can turn the water off and you can clean yourself. And if you need me, holler. I'll be out in the living room, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So it sounds like you're managing all that really well, Derek. And it is, it is tricky. This work is in talking about sexual behavior problems, sometimes I wish it were very black and white. It's like, oh, no, that's wrong. That's not okay. And this is okay. But, so often we're the experts. We are experts in this field. And so often we feel a little bit unclear, and we'll, talk with each other about what do you think about this? So I think that's another important part just for foster parents also is just, having a really good team around you so that you can share your experiences with other people and say, what do you think about this? So.
Well, and I try to validate age appropriately. So like my daughter's, like I said, 6, and she has a tendency to sometimes change her clothes in my bedroom, which I don't really know why, 'cause she has her own. But I'll come into the room not knowing she's there, and she'll cover up her chest. And she'll say, I don't want you to see my nipples. And I just turn around and cover my eyes and walk back out.
Oh, that's
so
sweet.
That she knows that that's okay. That's change in your own room. But, it's okay for you to not want somebody to see you. That's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And then really supporting her and having boundaries. I think that's a really important part for caregivers to learn to do really well as opposed to, I'm the boss and, you'll do what I say, but instead, I love it that you just turn around and really listen to her words and were responsive and respectful of her boundaries.
But for foster parents, that's a trickier dance because, you don't know the child super well, and you don't want to shame them about their body, but at the same time, you need to teach them those boundaries. So if they're not doing that, should foster parents say like, hey, if somebody comes in, you need to say, I'm in here, or cover up, or like what, you don't want to cause issues for them down the road either.
Right, absolutely. And I think you're right, Derek, that foster parents really do have a very, very, very challenging role in being supportive of the kids and also setting boundaries and listening to the kids' boundaries. And it's just really much more complicated than if it's a biological situation.
So if they don't have boundaries,
how
should the foster parent going about? Because it's a fine line between shaming them, and helping them make those.
Yeah, I think again, all roads for me lead back to the sexual behavior rules, which is why I skipped over to it. I think just being really clear, I really encourage parents that we're working with to post these on the refrigerator. And it's not a shaming thing. It's just like, in this house, it's not okay to look at other people's private parts or for other people to see your private parts or, that kind of thing. And just reminding them of what the rules are in a non-shaming sort of way. And so, it's like, let's well, I don't know. They may, be a little bit rebellious around that, and you can say, let's go back and review the sexual behavior rules or the rules in our house. People don't even have to call them sexual behavior rules. They can be integrated with other house rules as well.
Well, I was getting ready to say foster parents are required to post their house rules. So if you haven't already, you might consider adding some of these.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. All right. There's a few more of these, as if I'm reading this right. Oh, no, I'm clicking the wrong slide. I'm going to let you take control so I mess this up.
Oh, you want me? Okay, great.
Go ahead, Renee. We went back and forth, and I don't want to skip any.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to go back here just a second, so we don't miss that. And the developmental considerations, and this just is, we've already kind of talked about this, but just, kids that might be on the autism spectrum disorder also can struggle a little bit more with just knowing what, responding to social cues and knowing what the boundaries are and different kinds of developmental delays. And just as you and I have been talking about kind of how do we determine if this is problematic or not, those are some other things that we would take into consideration. So. And
again, all that becomes so much harder when you don't know the child well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, for foster parents, I think they've stopped using this term in psychology, and you can correct me, but it seems to me a lot of our kids had what they used to would have called arrested development.
Yeah.
Is that still a term? Is that still
No, it's not. But but I kind of like the term in a way. Now it would be more like a pervasive developmental disorder.
Okay.
probably.
So for those
Mhm.
kids, like
Mhm.
it's you may have a 13-year-old who
Mhm.
thinks like a 8 or 9-year-old,
Mhm.
and so
Yeah.
for those folks, you're saying you kind of have to assess where they are
Right.
mentally to
Yeah.
figure
So if
out
you
their
have a
motive.
if you have a 13-year-old child that has, as you referred to, arrested development in some way, or some kind of autism spectrum disorder, and they're acting out with an 8-year-old, that may, I don't know if I just use, like, let's say 12 and 8, you might look at that a little bit differently than if, and maybe even the 18-year-old's really sharp and knows the rules in the house, and really kind of is a big leader in the house, then you would look at that a little bit differently than if the 13-year-old is within the normal range in all areas of mental health and behavior, et cetera. So yeah, that's definitely taken into consideration.
And the other thing is a lot of kids in care have seen a lot more sexual behavior
Yeah.
than
Uh-huh.
traditional kids.
Yeah, and thanks for pointing that out. And I think that's another reason why, again, all roads lead back to the sexual behavior rules. Why it's like reestablishing for these kids what really is normal, what really does make sense, what's really healthy and safe for them. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that, again, for foster parents, that's a tricky thing to address. So because you certainly don't want to shame the bio family or make the child feel ashamed of their family,
Absolutely. Yeah.
but you need to make sure they understand that's not something that's okay in any house.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. And here we go.
Okay. So some myths and facts, and one of the fun things for me about these myths is that when I first started working, really putting a lot of effort into this work, probably about 9 years ago, 8 years ago, I had this goal that I wanted everybody in town, everybody in the Kansas City metro area to know that kids with sexual behavior problems have not necessarily been sexually abused. And that used to be sort of a mystery, and people would be surprised about that. And now it seems like just about everybody kind of gets that. So that's exciting. I think our culture is changing, and what we know about kids with sexual behavior problems is changing. And so one of the myths is that kids that have experienced sexual abuse have been sexually abused themselves, and on this list it's number 2. Actually that's not true, and as the fact says here, about 50% of kids with sexual behavior problems have experienced sexual abuse themselves, but about 98% have experienced some other kind of a trauma. So, and again, I would say, regardless of how difficult your family home is to live in with your biological parents, that it's still traumatic to have to leave that environment. And so, I think being pulled out of your home qualifies as a trauma. So, yeah, kids in foster care are going to be pretty highly likely, or more so than in the normal population, or the broader population, to experience sexual behavior problems. So, and then kind of back up to number 1. Or let me stop there. Derek, do you have any questions about that, or does that make sense
that
to
is
you?
new. I feel like that's new information actually for a lot of people, that it's only about half of the kids, I'm kind of skipping down, but only about half of the kids were actually abused themselves, because I think a lot of times as foster parents, where you're trying to put a puzzle together without 3/4 of the pieces and don't even have the box.
Absolutely.
And so you are piecing stuff together. So when a child acts out like this, I think for most of us, our intuition is, they probably were acted upon.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is only about half the time.
Yeah. What I said, maybe, maybe they were. But what I feel more certain about is that they witnessed domestic violence, or that that they just again have just been removed from their caregivers, which is a place that they knew and knew the rules about. Or I do think one of the things that we're seeing a lot more is exposure to pornography, and so that's one of the things that we always look at now when we see a kid who's acted out sexually. So yeah.
So for someone like me, I'm kind of a logical person. I look for the logical connection.
Yeah.
There's not, though, really a logical connection between an unrelated trauma and a child turning to some sort of sexual behavior that we can make any sort of correlation between, right?
Yeah. And I think what helps me understand it, Derek, is we talk about it, the language we use, the language I use, is a sexual behavior problem. But really, it's not really a sexual behavior problem. It's just a behavior problem. It just happens to include their genitals, but it could just as easily include, other things as well. So I think just us calling it a sexual behavior problem, it helps us know what we're talking about, but it's really kind of a misrepresentation of what the problem is most of the time.
So
does that make sense?
You're saying, so in a child's mind, they don't really see the difference between hitting another child, which is not okay, versus touching another child, which is not okay.
But both actions are actions to gain power over the other child. Yeah. So it's not necessarily when they touch someone on their private parts, it's not necessarily to touch them on their private parts, but it's a way to maybe shame them or to get power over it when it's a behavior problem. So and then same thing as when they hit them. So yeah. Well, I'm glad that's new information, Derek. I'm always pleased to be able to present something that that people haven't thought about before. I remember when I first started working as a sexual abuse therapist about 30 years ago, this psychologist I was working with said, it's always been funny to me that they call it sexual abuse. He said, if you hit me over the head with a pan, you wouldn't call it cooking abuse. So I think that's a good way to think about this as well. It's not really a sexual behavior problem. It's just a behavior problem. So the first myth that's listed on this, I think you and I have already kind of discussed, and just that all sexual behavior between children is normal. Well, a lot of sexual behavior between children is normal, but, some isn't. And, if it's hurtful or ongoing or pervasive or there's some level of compulsivity, then it's probably not good. So also, kids who have been sexually abused act out on other children later in life. That's also, I always say that's a tricky math problem. Certainly, sex offenders do have a high percentage of them have been sexually abused as kids, but it's not reversible. So a child who's experienced sexual abuse, we never, here at Moxam, we see about 500 kids a year that have experienced sexual abuse. We don't think of them as potential predators, or that's not highly likely to happen. There are a lot of other factors that have to come into play in order for a child to act out when they become an adult. So, and then also just another quick thing on that if a child has been sexually abused, actually they do every bit as well as kids that haven't been sexually abused in their adulthood when you rule out or when you have a supportive caregiver. So
it's really tricky to me how you would go about talking to a child as a foster parent to explain that this is, as far as society is concerned, I believe that probably these type actions are the most socially unacceptable, kind of generally across the board, regardless of your belief system or whatever.
Yeah.
How you relay that to a child without making them feel as if they themselves are shameful is something I'm not sure how you approach as a foster parent.
And you're talking about, I want to get clarification on the question. So if a child is acting out sexually, how do you respond to them?
When you're trying to explain why this is not.
Yeah. I don't know if I have a great answer for that, but I'll tell you just a little story. Here at Moxa, we have a program for youth with sexual behavior problems, and we see them every week and their caregivers. And when they first come in, both the children and the caregivers are sort of embarrassed, and oftentimes the kids are very ashamed. If it's a biological parent, they're oftentimes very ashamed of the child as well. And by the time they leave our program, it's an 18-week program, they almost all want to keep coming back. It's like, oh, do we have to quit? We wanted to keep coming. We have people that drive from Topeka and Warrensburg and Cass County and Platte County and Clay County, so people driving a long ways to come here, and they come every week. And I think it's because ultimately I think we want to manage ourselves well. You know, as kids, we want to be successful, and because when we're successful in managing ourselves well and within the boundaries, other people are kinder to us and they like us better. And so I think when we talk with kids about just them being great and amazing, when they're not, you know, touching other kids in ways that they shouldn't, and we don't harp on the sexual behavior problems here. In the 18 weeks that when they first come in, they talk about the sexual behavior problems that they've had, and then there's another week, I can't remember which week of the program it is, but where they talk about how they felt when they acted out on the child and what they did. And then there's at the end they do an apology letter. But for the most part, we're talking about ways to develop good, positive peer interactions, and we review the sexual behavior rules at the beginning of every group. We have kids from ages 6 to 14 in our group, and we always review the sexual behavior rules. We also review the stop steps, which I can't remember if they're in this slideshow or not, but there are a lot of different kinds of versions of that, because one of the things we know, and I hope I'm not talking too fast, but one of the things we also know about kids with sexual behavior problems is that they're kids with high levels of impulsivity. So, you know, they're kids that are likely to act out in an impulsive way. So we work over and over on the stop steps. And we also then support the caregivers in going over the stop steps, identifying places where the child might need to pay extra attention to, or might be more likely to struggle with using their stop steps, so the parents are reviewing with their kids before they go into situations. So I think maybe just focusing on solutions, you know, focusing on doing well and focusing on solutions, and is a way of talking about sexual behavior problems in a way that's not shaming, and just really being supportive in the fact that we know that the kids that we work with can be really successful in a lot of ways. So just believing in them, that goes a long ways.
And to further complicate the matter, like the newer research, it's showing that, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but trauma and ADD kind of mirror each other symptom-wise.
Mm-hmm. They do.
And that impulsivity goes hand in hand with the trauma that all of our kids have had.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, that was beautifully said, Derek, and it does complicate the situation a lot, which is then again when we go back to the impulse control, and we call them the stop steps. So and we just teach those to the kids over and over and over again about how to develop that. I'm trying to think of what we call it. You know, the lizard brain, the monkey brain, and what's the one that's the most developed? Like the monkey brain, I guess. So you know, we all have the ability to develop that, because even though trauma, you're right, does cause kids trauma and cause behaviors that are impulsive and look like ADD or ADHD, even sometimes when they're not. But sometimes it's a co-occurrence between trauma and a biological experience as well.
Sure.
I told you sometimes I rambled. I'm getting.
Oh no, you're doing great. I think this is great information.
Okay, good.
But I did move us to the next slide.
Okay, great. Thank you, Derek. So I think this number 4 is particularly relevant for foster parents. That historically we've looked at kids that were acting out sexually and just said, wow, they just can't be at home with anybody else. They have to be separated. And what we know now is that, again, that adds another trauma for a kid to go live with somebody else. And there are just lots of good treatment available now specifically for sexual behavior problems, and lots of great supervision strategies to support kids. I know that there's probably nobody that knows as well as foster parents about the importance of line of sight supervision, always keeping the children in your line of sight and figuring out ways to do that, and getting for caregivers to get support around doing that. So it's probably best for kids to, for the most part, not all the time, but for the most part, to remain where they're at with other kids. And kind of onto that next slide too, oftentimes when kids had sexual behavior problems, they were pretty immediately sent into inpatient or residential treatment. And the truth is that also used to be more of an option than it is now. There just really aren't very many inpatient or residential treatment programs in the area anymore, and certainly not in the area that have expertise in supporting kids with sexual behavior problems. So the outpatient treatment is shown to be most effective. And another quick note on the outpatient treatment is that something that we used to do, when I say we, I mean mental health providers, that wasn't very effective or useful, was that we used to keep kids in treatment for a long time. And, if you think about it, like a 10-year-old going into treatment and staying in treatment for 2 years, that's like almost 20% of their life.
Right.
That they're being treated for acting out, and it kind of becomes part of their identity. So our program, which is evidence-based, is 18 weeks. And, which is still a pretty long time for a kid, like 5 to 6 months. But they don't need to go into treatment for the rest of their lives. So I think that's an important piece. And then
so I have two questions that come up with these first 2 points. First, so what do you think of, like, for foster parents, a lot of times it's like, well, your best bet is to get a door alarm, I guess, for night, on the kid's door or whatever. Is that what you would recommend?
I think there's you asked me about the hardest question, Derek, that for me to answer. There's a part of me that really resists that kind of thing, and I've seen families really be able to kind of settle in and feel more confident about their child's behavior. And I also think sometimes it adds a piece of accountability for a child that can be really helpful in managing their behavior. I think ultimately it's about how that door alarm is talked about. So, if the door alarm is put up and I don't think it's a good idea to say to the child, you're not trustworthy, we can't trust you to keep safe. And so then it just kind of exacerbates the situation. But, if it's talked about and said, you know what, we all struggle with managing ourselves well in different ways. And we hope that you find this to be really helpful, that whenever your door opens, we're going to know. And so we're going to check in on you and see, that you're doing okay, or that kind of thing. So I think when alarms or video, there's, in a way it's amazing and fantastic. There's all this really great video equipment now also, that can really be a great asset for parents. And again, I think it's in the way that we talk about it that makes a difference. So I'm glad that we have these tools available to us that we didn't used to have. And that also with that luxury comes a burden, I think, for us to use them effectively and responsibly and well and with kindness. So,
well, maybe just refer to it as their reminder alarm.
Yeah,
remind
absolutely.
them to be where they're supposed to be when they're supposed to be there, type thing.
I love that. Yeah, I need help. I've got a little alarms on my cell phone. So.
My phone goes off to remind me to go do things. Yours goes off to remind you to do or not to do things. And
absolutely.
And then,
great question.
Secondly, though, I don't know how you weigh, for a foster parent, I don't know how you weigh, you talked about how for it to be problematic and abusive, there has to be usually some sort of coercion involved. So you have a child. A lot of times, the victim, for lack of a better term, is another child in the house.
Right.
And so, how do you not further traumatize the victim child while trying to help the perpetrator child?
Yeah, I mean, that's just an awesome question. I think, number one, also, today we're talking about youth with sexual behavior problems, so we're talking about the actor-outers, and how to respond to that. But, first, definitely needs to be a response to the child that's been acted out upon, and, making sure that if they have been traumatized by this, that they have access to treatment, hopefully that they are able to access treatment before the child who's acted out accesses treatment, that a safety plan is put in place with help from the child who's been injured, so that they can access safety. So absolutely, that's a really important piece to this whole puzzle. And you're right, oftentimes they are in the same house. And so back to kind of that alarm situation, there are things like that that also can provide a sense of safety and support for the child also who's been victimized.
So for a foster parent, how should they go about determining that? Because how quickly can kids get in, say, to your program or a program to get an expert opinion before, you know what I'm saying? Like when something happens, you don't want to wait a couple months to get in to get an opinion and have more things happen.
Yeah, sure. So if a child has been victimized and a call is made to MOXA, if the family can come in during the day, so business hours, and when I say business hours, even anytime between like 8 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, we can get people in pretty quickly within a couple of weeks. Those evening and late afternoon hours, it is more difficult, and it takes up to a month to get somebody in. But I think it's important for the families to know, and any social workers, et cetera, that we can get people in more quickly when people are able to be a little bit flexible with their schedules. So,
and then, of course, for different areas have other resource centers too, like the Child Advocacy Center in the Northwest, and I'm sure every area has something. But what I'm as a foster parent, I'm sitting here going, a couple weeks.
Yeah.
What do I do in the meantime?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in the meantime, you can always make a call to MOXA. Latoya Love is a therapist on our staff that specializes in working with youth with sexual behavior problems and their families, and I'm sure she would be more than happy to provide some phone support and guidance to families that were experiencing difficulty. And her number is area code 816-285-1343, and her name is Latoya Love.
Okay. So like for an emergency, like I just need to know, do I need to act on this, or do I need to plan B? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Thanks.
Perfect. And then the last point we didn't actually go over yet, but I do think that is still a serious conception for most people, that, if you were acted on, you're much more likely to act on someone else.
Yeah. And, the research just doesn't support that. Again, it's a tricky math problem in that adult sex offenders are more likely than the general population to have experienced sexual abuse, but kids who have been sexually abused are not more likely to grow up to be sex offenders. So, they just don't. And again, with treatment, kids who have experienced sexual abuse, and without treatment, kids who have experienced sexual abuse can end up doing really well when they have good support from their caregivers. And when their caregivers believe them and support them, they do every bit as well as kids that haven't experienced sexual abuse.
I call it the Law and Order effect, because all those crime shows, it's always the foster kid. you know, the killer, the serial, whatever. It's always one of the things in their file is, well, they were a foster kid. And I think that there's, especially sexual behaviors, a lot of times it's portrayed that way in movies and TV.
Well, that's an unfortunate stereotype.
Yeah. Well, trust me.
Yeah.
I've written letters over this. So.
Oh, good for you.
Well, I haven't changed it, but I try.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Well, keep it up.
So now we're going to shift a little bit from psychology to development.
Yep.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay. So in a way, I've already kind of reviewed everything on this slide, and with your help, Derek, as well, because that second piece is about playing doctor and kind of the normalcy of that. So, I think it's probably without much more discussion. I do think on that cultural and societal factors that impact what's typical versus what's problematic, that the boundaries are getting broader and kids are having a lot of access to highly sexualized material on television and the internet. I don't have to go into that. We all know that.
But real fast.
Yeah.
So for foster parents,
yeah,
like this whole playing doctor thing, if I don't think much of that and nobody's ever caught me and it's just something I do with new kids, for foster kids, there's a lot of times new kids coming in all the time.
Yeah.
And so it's even harder to determine, okay, is this serialized behavior, or is this just because you didn't think anything of this? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. And I think a lot of times it's kind of embracing the mystery. You know, you're not going to know a lot about what the child has done before, but what you can respond to is what you do know, and that even if it's playing doctor, you know, even in I'm going to use air quotes, a normal situation with a normal child, if you caught them playing doctor and taking their clothes off and, you know, listening to each other's hearts or whatever, you wouldn't say, oh, carry on, this is great. You know, you'd say, hey, guys, you need to get your shirts back on, and when kids play together, you need to, you know, they need to wear their clothes and not do this. And I mean, so this thing kind of just limits setting and knowing that, there's going to be a lot about your kids' histories that you're just never going to know. And kids, you know, they don't talk. They don't use language the same way that we do. So if we said to them, so how many times have you done this before? You know, they really wouldn't be able to answer. You know, they developmentally, especially the younger they are, just really don't have the ability to answer that. So in a real accurate way, you know, mathematically accurate way. So I think just responding to the behavior that's in front of you and being as gracious and at the same time limit setting as you possibly can be. Did that answer your
without
question,
blurting out of your mouth what's going through your head when you walk in and go, oh my God, what the?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm just thinking about a number of different examples of things parents have shared with us over the years and how difficult that can be. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. So this is a little bit more kind of looking at what's typical, what's normal, and there are 3 slides here, and then we're going to get into this group of slides that wherever we talk, this next group of slides are always the most popular and people are most interested. So I'll keep this part kind of short as we move up to
Stay tuned. Stay tuned.
Yeah, absolutely. 3 more slides. So so just stuff that Derek and I have been talking about already, that, you know, kids touch each other, and it's a part of what's been happening since the beginning of time. And what we know about typical developmental sexual development is that kids are curious. They're exploring. It's also spontaneous, which is different than what I mentioned at the very beginning of this webinar about when it's problematic. Sometimes there's a level of, the word I would use is like compulsivity, a level of impulsiveness and not being able to stop themselves. So so in typical sexual behavior, it's just like it just kind of happens spontaneously, occasionally, every once in a while it will happen intermittently as opposed to kind of ongoing and regularly lifting itself up as problematic. So there's agreement, so consent. They may not use words, but you can tell that they agreed that they would touch each other, or one of them would touch the other one. So the kids are within this similar age, which we've already kind of reviewed. There aren't any really strong emotions involved, so the kid's not touching the other child's private parts with a lot of anger or sadness or that kind of thing. And this occurs across childhood. I'm trying to think also, I'm trying to think of that research exactly. So little girls are actually, I think, a little bit more likely to act out sexually on each other than little boys are. And in fact, we have two groups here at Moxa, one for kids ages like 9 and under, and one for like 10 and up approximately. And in our younger kids group, it's usually about close to half and half in terms of having little girls and boys. And then the bigger kids group, so ages 10 and 11 up to 13 or 14, those kids, it's kind of unusual. I think we might have 2 girls in that group now, but we have like 12 kids in the group. So, but I don't know that we don't have girls in that group with that much frequency. So, because as the girls get older, they stop doing that usually. But when I think some people are kind of surprised when they learn that little girls are pretty likely to act out sexually on each other. So, are
little girls more likely to do it to other little girls?
Well, I don't know. That's a good question.
I think
sure.
girls are brushing their hair and doing makeup, like all that stuff, and
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. Okay. And the sexual behaviors occur with kids that they know because that's who they're with. So.
Okay, so here's a hypothetical that's not that hypothetical. This past couple of weeks, there's been a little boy that has been running around at my daughter's daycare, grabbing the girl's vagina. So that's really probably more about the response he gets from the girls than it is the actual action. Is what the logical, not dad side of me says. Is that, because that's not uncommon at a daycare or something like that, right?
That sort of bothers me, actually, Derek. And the reason that it bothers me is it's not spontaneous, or the way that you're describing it. It's like playing the grapevine game.
I would have to find out the details of it, sure,
yeah. But the way that it's being described, it's not spontaneous. It's not just like this little boy just grabbed another little girl's vagina, but that he's doing it regularly. It sounds like it's not intermittent, but there's some level of compulsivity around it. It's not really exploratory. It's more, even if it's getting attention, it's still really, it sounds like a sort of problematic sexual behavior to me.
Well, then I'm making a phone call when we get off here. So.
Pardon?
All right. I'm going to make a phone call when we get off.
Yeah, and just in terms of it also sends I think an inaccurate message to the other kids in the child care center about that, like some level of that being okay, or it's not that big of a deal. That I think some more boundaries need to be set up for the little boy so that he can manage himself. It also ultimately doesn't feel good to him when he's acting out. He knows that it's a behavior problem. So anyway,
Cool. All right. Well, I got work to do.
Okay.
All right. So here's the big slides, right?
Yeah. And like I said, I think there are 3 or 4 of these. And so first of all, bringing these slides up, I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer. Again, people love them, and I love that people are interested. This is the work of Toni Cavanaugh Johnson. So anybody with what I call the Google machine can enter her name in. It's Toni Cavanaugh Johnson. And there's a little booklet that these came out of. It's really nice to help people understand kind of what's green, what's okay, it's just normal, it's no big deal, what's yellow might be a little bit problematic, and what's red, meaning like, this is not good. So I love it, and the disclaimer is just because it says something's like questions about private parts from a 0 to 5-year-old, that's really normal. It is. But, is it happening over and over again, and they just kind of can't seem to get redirected into other things. And so just because it says on this list that it's okay doesn't mean it's okay. Same thing with because it says it's red or not okay doesn't mean that it's like really bad or a really big problem. There's one example in here. I think it's in here. There's some the jury's kind of out on. Sometimes people believe that if children are putting things into their anuses, that's automatically a really bad sign. And I've actually read some research that shows that actually kids, they put things in their ears and their noses and their anuses, and so it's not necessarily immediately as bad as people think. So just don't take this completely like as gospel, and I think it's good. So I think it's a good, I'll move on to the next slide. So school-age kids. I would say in this area, we're beginning to see, again, because of the high level of access that kids have to pornography on the Internet, beginning to see kind of a higher level of red behaviors that are occurring as a result of of being exposed to pornography as opposed to having been sexually abused. Because there's some behaviors that we might say, even though I said only 50% of the kids have been sexually abused, but when the behavior is really stuff that they really could not have known about other than an adult teaching them, used to be kind of a sign of sexual abuse, but now, again, our first hypothesis is probably they've been exposed to pornography. Did that make sense, Derek?
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking, like, even, I'm pushing 40, so there's that. But when I was a kid in cartoons or whatever, if, Bugs Bunny thought, I can't remember her name, but the female bunny, if he thought she was cute, his eyes bulged out. It was like a big hooga type thing. But nobody ever said she was hot or she was, whatever. And I think now probably even our kids' TV shows use more everyday language that we'd actually use. And that makes the kids talk about it differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They just have a lot higher access to stuff that would have been considered inappropriate when...
Well, because even if I wanted to, my eyes couldn't bulge and I couldn't float in the air.
Right.
But now that if that's what everybody says, if the word is she's hot or whatever, well, that's just what you say,
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly there's a slide on that earlier that I just kind of skimmed over, but our culture's changing, and I think that's really hard too for people your age or people my age, and most foster parents are a little bit older. They're not 22, 23 years old. Some are, but most are a little bit older, and so we also have kind of a clash of this new culture that is much more sexualized compared to the cultural norms when you were a child or when I was a child. So,
well, I think a lot of foster parents are fairly conservative. And a lot of foster kids do not come from what I would call traditionally conservative homes.
Right.
And so there's a little bit of a culture clash there too by nature.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was telling someone earlier this morning, I remember years ago learning that, most foster families are really well organized in their systems, and then kids that are taken into foster care, kids that come from much less organized systems, and just that clash in and of itself can be really challenging for everybody.
Sure.
Yeah.
All
All right. So more of this. This is the older kids. And Derek, do the people that are listening to this or watching this today have access to these slides after this is over?
We can get it to them. Of course, they can just go back and pause. I mean, this will be a video format.
Okay. Oh, great.
But
Okay.
Pause these at any time to
Good.
get them to you.
And again, you can, if you're listening today, you can access this through what I call the Google machine by putting in Tony Kavanaugh Johnson and sexual behaviors. So.
Sure.
In this this is one of the places that I think can be a little bit problematic. So from 9 to 12, a red behavior is shown anything involving penetration, and that's kind of depending on what it is. It's not necessarily just a really tragic sign, but
probably
tragic.
More referring to penetration of someone else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. But some of these things are parents are going, a lot of you get to 12, 13, a lot of kids do a lot of private time in their bedrooms, and you start wondering, like, what are you doing in there? So, but that's not uncommon.
No, our bodies are made to be touched, and which is kind of the whole sexual behavior problems as well. That our bodies are made to be touched. They respond to being touched, and people touch themselves in a sexual way, and all that is just very common and very normal. Kind of going back to the sexual behavior rule, that it's okay to touch yourself as long as you're in private and it doesn't take very long. So, has the behavior become compulsive? Is it interfering with the amount of time they're spending with other kids, or watching TV, or spending with the family? Then there's some intervention that needs to take place. But
and the other one that's trickier to navigate, I think, is sending or receiving sexual images.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And, that's clearly against the sexual behavior rules. It's not okay to look at other people's private parts. It's not okay to show your private parts to other people. And so I think I know all roads lead back to the sexual behavior rules, but I think that's really helpful in especially with the sending and receiving of information or of sexual content. It's just not okay to look at other people's private parts without their permission. So,
so common now with the apps and stuff.
Yeah, we see it a lot. In fact, we're in the process of developing kind of a short program for kids that, haven't really done anything terrible, but maybe the parents find out that they sent pictures of themselves, naked pictures of themselves, to their girlfriend or boyfriend. And so anyway, we're developing a little short term. I think it's 4 to 6 weeks that parents can access for kids that might have engaged in that kind of behavior. That it is actually, I want to say it's not illegal. It is actually illegal. It's a federal crime to distribute child pornography, unfortunately. So it can be really dangerous in that way for kids. But and it's important that the kids know that. But it is, like you said, really not uncommon. In fact, I was sitting here one day with one of our other therapists who's worked in this field as long as I have. So between the two of us, we have about 60 years of experience. And people say, well, everybody's doing it. Everybody's drinking, everybody's smoking marijuana, and we know everybody's actually not. It seems like that to some kids, but we know actually most people are not drinking alcohol or to excess or using marijuana. but we sort of kind of looked at each other and laughed. It's like everybody's doing it. Yeah, I mean, it does seem like everybody's sending naked pictures of, the teenagers to each other. And so you're right. It's not uncommon, but it is problematic though still. Does that make sense?
It's tricky. And then we get into the little human beings who are by their nature tricky all the time, the teenagers.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So
here we are at the teenagers,
yeah,
and I think just look at this one. Kind of has the piece in the yellow in the middle about when masturbation interferes with getting other tasks done, and some secretiveness around sexuality, which you kind of want people to be a little bit secret or at least private around
at that
their
age,
sexuality. Yeah, absolutely. So.
Okay. So with the kids, like I said, we know not everyone's doing it, but man, oh man, a lot. I would almost bet it's, by the time you get to this 16, 17, I would almost bet it's more than half of the kids really are doing it now.
Yeah, I don't know what the numbers are, but I wouldn't be surprised, sure.
And so, I guess what I'm trying to say is don't pick any one of these out and say, oh, they did that. They're something's severely wrong.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's right. Again, kind of my warning before we looked at these slides. Everybody loves these slides. I love these slides. And, we want to be careful that it can be each one of these things need to have some interpretation with that child's developmental level and past experience, et cetera.
And generally, is it safe to say none of them in isolation, in and of itself, is enough to constitute a major red flag, usually?
Well, I think if it's over in the red category, that it's definitely worth a second look.
Sure. But you don't need to panic.
Right, no.
Right.
Yeah, panic's generally not helpful no matter where you are.
True.
Yeah.
Well, but, as a foster parent, you say that, but as a foster parent, you kind of do, sometimes you do need to panic a little bit about something.
That's
to
true.
keep the other kids safe,
You're right, Derek. Yeah.
And so it's just a different world we live in.
Yeah, and I'm really thankful to you today for representing foster parents in this discussion. It's been super helpful.
It's a little different. So then we get to the, how do you try to avoid these things?
Yeah, so all roads go back to supervision. And, I can think of a lot of reasons why this is hard, and I've worked with a lot of parents over the years and foster parents who talk about how this is hard, and I get that. It is really hard. But also, not eating too much sugar or, working out regularly or even going to work every day sometimes can be kind of hard, but those are our goals. And so I think we want to set our goals high. And so these are supervision goals. I know that, parents that have 100% line of sight supervision of 4 or 5 kids is impossible. But how can parents work foster parents work so that they can increase their levels of supervision? How can they set things up so that, homework time, everybody is maybe working in the living room together so the parent is able to supervise them really well while that's being done? Or anyway, so just trying to figure out working hard to develop a plan, a supervision plan, and especially if, I would say especially for foster parents. And if you have a child who has broken a sexual behavior rule, then the supervision needs need to go up even higher. So, what do you think about that, Derek?
a newer kid in your house.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Until you know them.
Yeah. Kids with impulsivity struggles that when you get them because they've had maybe an ADD or ADHD diagnosis or extreme levels of trauma, any past history of acting out in any way against other kids or animals. So, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So, here are...
You're going to throw these at me, and I'm going to fail, so go ahead.
How about you pick one, and we'll talk about that.
Okay. I would think that probably, oh gosh, I just read the third one. I think that the two 12-year-olds watching pornographic videos is probably second to occurrence about kids receiving and sending nude pictures.
Sure. Yeah.
So maybe the 12-year-old, like, is that, it's a problem because they had access to pornography, but is it abnormal? I don't know. I don't think so.
Well, I think it's normal for kids to explore sexuality, and that's so. Yeah, I think it's probably pretty normal behavior. Some questions that you would need to ask, I think, would be, what were you guys looking at? Because if they put in the word penis or sex or something like that, it's like, okay. But at 12 years old, we've seen some pretty extreme kind of sexual behaviors looked at pornographically. Example that I oftentimes give is a 10-year-old little boy who was living in a foster home, and he had a really tough history. That we were doing a sexual education piece for the kids in the group, and it's with the parents. The parents are in there when we do that, and the kids have the opportunity to ask questions. And the 10-year-old asked the question, what about when people are hurting each other when they're having sex? And I'll never forget that because it almost took my breath away. I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this little boy has had access to that. This little boy, it was right when the movie Shades of Grey had come out, which, I'm an adult and I, oftentimes make really good decisions, and I have the ability to think well and make decisions and be thoughtful about what I decide to watch. And he didn't really have the ability to make, it's like, oh, that sounds exciting. So, he just, his little lizard brain turns on and says, okay, let's flip the switch and watch that, So I would want to know what the kids are watching because they can see some stuff that really would need some debriefing and some really big discussion. Or, are they looking at pictures of penises on the internet? So, which is, fairly common behavior, and you would see that. So first I want to know what, so what are you guys looking at when you're looking on here on the computer? And I'm also interested in how did you guys decide to do this? So oftentimes another problem is that there'll be an older kid, so those two 12-year-olds are the younger of a sibling group, and the older kid has exposed them to a lot of really kind of yucky stuff on pornography. So I want to know that too, or are they just two 12-year-old kids that are like, okay, let's figure this out together,
Let's look at boobs,
Yeah, and in fact, we had one of our first kids that we treated in our program was a little girl who had been exposed to pornography, and then as a result was engaged in taking some pictures of some pretty unfortunate stuff because she'd been exposed to a lot of stuff. So, and sending those pictures out. So, yeah, I just have some questions. How often are you guys doing this together, or how often are you doing this alone? How did you figure out how to get around the parental controls?
Right. Well, okay, so
yeah.
does it matter? Like, I mean, there's the World Wide Web has opened up all kinds of craziness.
Yeah.
And so does it matter if they're looking at, when I was a kid, it was Playboy, like
Sure.
that was, whatever. So
Yeah.
there's, I'll call it Playboy pornography versus,
Yeah.
I mean, there's everything from, like you said, violent sexual encounters to probably bestiality and everything else. Does it
Absolutely.
matter what they are looking at to determine that?
Well, I think, I think it does matter. There's a possibility because there's so much stuff out there. There's a possibility they can stumble upon some bestiality or sadomasochistic kinds of stuff. But more likely they kind of escalate to looking at that kind of stuff. It's like first they look at pictures of penises, and then it escalates to looking at people beating each other up while they're having sex with each other. So, I think it does matter. And one of the things that it can also be quite traumatic for a child to see some of the photographs that they could be exposed to. It's sort of a form of sexual abuse. Yeah. One of the things is a woman, Marie Crabb, who Moxa is bringing in actually October 24th. And keep your eye on our website if you're interested in attending that. We're selling a limited number of tickets for $55 a piece, but not yet. They'll get that going in the next week. But she's from Australia, and she basically talks about that our kids are getting their sex education from pornography, which is really unfortunate. So, we need to be doing a really great job of talking with them and teaching kids what our own values are around sexuality. So there's one other piece that I want to say here. I'm going to back up a little bit. Also, two pieces actually. One is that you talked about Playboy pornography. So today's pornography, one of the workshops that I was in said today's pornography is not your dad's pornography.
Right.
So it's not Playboy. It's stuff that back when, in the 60s and 70s, I think most people would never have dreamed of seeing, in print. And so, also, let me say this correctly, of the 50 most commonly viewed pornographic films, 80% of them display violence against another human being. So, and they also, pornographic films are also not subject to being critiqued on their stereotyping. So every racial stereotype you can possibly imagine. African American men are portrayed as being very violent, and so not only is it just kind of horrible stuff, it's just horrible stuff on top of horrible stuff. That's just really unacceptable. So, but then the other point that I want to make is that we used to work in this program at really supporting families on getting their parental controls on, watching that, like the idea, we had the idea that that parents could kind of stop their kids' access to it. But we realize now that so many of our kids have had access to pornography in the school setting. The kids know more about the how to use the computers than the parents do. Yep. That getting engaged and trying to stop it. Although we encourage parents to continue to do that, use parental controls, et cetera, but the kids access it at school, they access it on the school bus, and the goal for the parents that we're working with is really more about developing relationships and supporting kids on being able to talk and ask questions and help, and the parents helping the kids find other things to do, satisfying activities that they can do as opposed to looking at pornography. So,
well, and the other thing is,
you never get me started on pornography.
Well, the other thing is even if you block everything else blocked, you can't block the other kids at school. And,
yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right.
When I was a kid, this dates me again, but I could probably think of one kid who might have been able to have been talked into sending something like that. But now, take a whole lot to talk a lot of kids into that. So
readily accessible. So.
Yeah. All right.
So
the caregiver's role.
Yeah, and I think I already mentioned this, that just the caregiver encouragement is that it says it's one of the number one factors. It actually is the number one factor that lead to positive outcome for a child with a harmful sexual behavior. And at MOXA, our program includes the caregiver, so the kids go to group at the same time. A caregiver is required to attend group at the very same time, so they're receiving information about the very same stuff that kids are receiving, and they get homework assignments for the families to do together. And it's very much a team effort between all the therapists on staff and the caregivers and kids. So, and again, we find it everyone finds it really satisfying. All the exit interviews are really positive because, us caregivers are like, oh, 1 more hour, and that's how most of them come in, like, oh, I don't want to do this, and then they end up really, really, really enjoying it. So,
of course, as a foster parent, it's still kind of shooting at the target with a blindfold on.
Yeah, absolutely. We do feel like we have a lot of foster parents that go through our program, and we do feel like it is really supportive for the foster parents. And you're right, it is kind of like shooting at a blind target, but I think the foster parents that go through our program feel like they really develop a lot of language and skills and understanding to support kids going through their homes more effectively. So,
it's just hard if your values or the things you learned or the things you're doing are flying directly in the face of home.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah, it's really hard. Okay.
So then these skills, what I would add to what you already have is, if foster parents have a good relationship with the bio family, try to help bridge the gap for these skills to the bio family.
Yeah, and depending on, as you guys know better than I do, there are different levels of involvement of the biological families, and but we oftentimes have foster families and/or kids that are in foster care. We have their biological parents going through the program with foster parents, and/or just the biological parents, and the foster parents will sit out in the waiting room and wait. They've come up with all different kinds of arrangements, ones that make sense for their situations, and we just support them on that about what's best. But we've had a large number of kids that we had up to 7 or 8 caregivers engaged in the program. So, yeah. Come one, come all.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you can do it, that's better for everybody. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think this is just more about kind of working with parents, and I like the way that you think about this as being the foster parents working with biological parents of kids and just being supportive of them.
And it'll help your case manager too, because if for some reason the bio family says, well, this is ridiculous, what's the big deal, he's 10 now, he should be looking, whatever.
Yeah.
Then that tells the caseworker some information that they need to know as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had caseworkers come through the program, by the way, a number of different times. So, and who have reported that it's really valuable information for them. So, okay.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Oops.
Oh.
Wrong way. I got you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, great. So talking about caregivers, we recognize how really, 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 really difficult this is for caregivers, especially when they have a child who is really struggling with compulsive kinds of sexual behavior problems. So we just want to encourage everybody to take good care of themselves, and kind of, it's not unusual for people to turn to their own kind of self-defeating behaviors, and just trying to engage those healthy coping skills. So when you're dealing with a child that has difficulty,
stay cognizant of your stuff too.
Pardon me?
The caregiver has to stay cognizant of their own stuff, whatever that is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and cognizant of continuing in self-care for themselves and not let that go. We hear parents, and I've been this parent, it's like, I just don't have time for that. It's like, I know, and you're not going to make it if you don't stop and do something for yourself. So, yeah.
All right, and then some resources and folks can get to.
Yeah, and there's nothing specific there, although I would say that Moxa is an amazing resource for working with kids with sexual behavior problems and supporting caregivers in helping their kids around that. So, yeah.
And you guys are right in downtown.
Yeah, we are downtown. We also have a outreach site it's Fairmont, which is on the western side of Independence, I think.
Okay.
So we do have an outreach site there. We don't have a full program for youth with sexual behavior problems there, but we do have an outreach site where children that have experienced sexual abuse could receive care, and caregivers could receive support. So, yeah.
And out of curiosity, are these all in-house, or are any of these things ever done for folks who live in the rural areas or at distances via technology at all?
Yeah, unfortunately, Moxa doesn't have any resources in the rural communities. We have several outreach sites. We have one in Kansas, and but it's not rural Kansas. It's in Overland Park. We have an outreach site at Berry Road at St. Luke's North. We have one, like I said, in Fairmont, which is on the eastern side or western side of Independence. I'm forgetting a couple of our other outreach sites, but not any like in Cameron or Warrensburg or Springfield or those areas.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, pretty much the KC metro area.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. So then some strategies. This is what I keep harping on, because as a foster parent, it's even harder because you don't really know the kid very well in a lot of cases, and it just makes it worse.
Yeah. So I think the one piece that I want to take out of this slide is just one of the things that we are regularly doing is encouraging families to find things that they enjoy doing together. And oftentimes families will do something like nobody had any fun or nobody liked it. It's like, awesome. Now you know. For your family, roller skating doesn't work. That's great that you guys took the time to figure that out. So now what next? And just really, and we've seen a lot of fun things, parents making decisions to do some rollerblading with their kids and hiking, and families that like to play cards together, whatever, that have worked really hard to find the things that they enjoy doing together, because it's doing those really helpful, healthful kinds of activities ultimately that will support kids in not engaging in the negative kind of sexual behavior problems.
So when you're discussing the behavior and things, my wife will hunt me down if I don't ask this question. I notice you keep saying you're referring to privates. Do you use the actual? She would very much beat me if I didn't use the clinical terms, which just say penis and vagina.
Sure.
Is that appropriate?
Yeah. And in this case, I'm talking about like kids of both genders or all genders, and so I'm just using private parts as a general word, but to encompass all of those. But yeah, we do believe that it's really important. It's a part of our program is learning the accurate names for all of the private parts and for families to use that terminology. So thank you to your wife on that. Yeah, and because, when we refer to our private parts as we hear people refer to, well, I don't have to say some of the names, you guys know the names, that can be sort of demeaning or, not really holding our bodies with the kind of value that we want to think about our bodies with. Right. So, yeah.
And she's always telling kids, a lot of kids call it their bad spot, and she's like, there are no bad spots on your body. Like,
that's right.
Bad about you.
That's right. Yeah.
that's your penis, just like
Yeah.
that's your elbow, like that's
Yeah.
just a part of you.
Absolutely, or
So,
nasty. We hear that in nasty
yeah,
parts, and yeah, absolutely. Sometimes those parts can get kind of nasty if we don't keep them all cleaned up. But
yeah.
that's your private part. It's very special for you, and yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Uh-oh. Another quiz. All right. Oh gosh.
You pick.
You made these. These are getting harder as we go. So I think an 8 and a 6-year-old are pretty comparably aged, and it's not okay, but that's not probably. I don't. It probably wouldn't rise to the level of abuse, right?
That's a behavior of concern for me.
Sure.
Because he's touched and would need to be reported, I think.
I guess it's
Hotline.
doing it repeatedly from the way that's worded.
Yeah, it has been touching his
Yeah.
6-year-old's breast and vagina after bedtime. So yeah.
Okay, so like a one-time thing, not good, but repeated, then that becomes a different level.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I also think, and this is just a made-up story, so it's hard to know what the truth is about this. But I do think that so an 8-year-old foster kid touches his sister's breast one time. Yeah, I mean, you want to talk about him, you want to separate him, you want to, support them in not doing that. But this is ongoing, has been touching breast and vagina. So then I'm like a little bit more. This is a pretty concerning kind of behavior, and I think in terms of what to do, again, just supporting each of them, separating them, letting them know, having separate sleeping arrangements, supporting the little girl on feeling safe all the time, and especially at night. And this might be one of those places where an alarm, maybe they both get alarms on their door, so you can hear if her, everybody knows if her door opens, or I don't know, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, and for foster parents, add to your list, notify the case manager.
Yes, thank you.
So they know.
Yeah.
So the second scenario is kind of the same thing. It's the multiple occasions that makes that different.
Yeah. And just at first glance, it's also a fairly significant sexual behavior problem. It's a 13-year-old ask a 4-year-old to pull down their pants. The big difference in age there is it's like, no, you can't do that. This is problematic. So, and I would want that bigger kid in this story to be in treatment, especially that it's identified in this scenario that he has Asperger's syndrome, which is an outdated language. Sorry about that. So he's probably in need of a little bit more support in developing stop steps and social cues and all that kind of thing. So
the thing I've noticed
that lets me know he's in trouble.
Sure, but you have not made any differentiation about gender as far as it doesn't matter if it's a boy doing it to a boy, a girl to a girl, or a boy to a girl. It's all the same.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and people get kind of confused about that sometimes, I think. So, yeah.
Sure. Okay. So now some practices for folks?
Yeah. So I think I'll just say super quickly that I'm a huge believer in evidence-based practices. So my hope is that for the foster parents that are listening out there, that when you're identifying a therapist to work with your child, that if the child is exhibiting sexual behavior problems, TFCBT, so trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, is shown to be really effective when some additional information is provided regarding sexual behavior problems specifically. So that's a really effective treatment. There's also the OU UPSB, CBT, lots of letters, University of Oklahoma Problem Sexual Behavior Cognitive Behavioral Therapy program that we do here at Moxa, which is the only evidence-based treatment available in the U.S. specifically for kids with sexual behavior problems. But again, one of the things you get when you go with an evidence-based treatment is probably a shorter treatment span, which is great for kids, and then also the really actively, both TFCBT and the one we use here, the OU-PSB-CBT, have a really high level of parent, caregiver engagement, which is just absolutely critical for the youth's recovery.
All right. And
Did I lose you there, Derek?
No.
Okay.
I'm right here. Okay. So, all right. So that kind of covers the adults in the picture.
We've already kind of talked about the caregivers, the sexual behavior rules and supervision, and the quality of developing that relationship with the kids, and so.
Which is tricky for foster parents, of course.
It's very hard, very, very hard. And kind of back to that slide again, like the sex education topics, between foster parents, and if it's a biological situation, then you get to decide what's important to you and what your values are around that. But if it's a foster child, then you really are needing to be really super careful about that.
And for foster parents, if you're nervous about having that conversation with a kid, and it needs to be had, but sometimes they twist things a different way or don't quite relay what you said correctly or whatever, have that conversation with the worker, with the child. So that way there's no question about what you said or didn't say. So.
That's great, yeah.
Okay.
Great suggestion. Thank you.
There we go. All right, for the kids?
Yeah. I've already mentioned most of these already, too, that some of the things that are included or should be included are some kinds of things around privacy and boundaries. And one of the things I haven't focused on today, and really I'm recognizing this as I'm looking at these slides as kind of a overlook on my part, is the importance of abuse prevention skills. So going back to your wife's value in calling private parts by their accurate names, really teaching kids, if I can't talk or we can't talk with our kids about their private parts, then that makes them more at risk for somebody else to talk to them about it in a way that we don't want. So, really supporting kids on saying no and being in charge of their own bodies. And sometimes the prevention work will say something like the only adults that can touch you are like a medical professional. And I would say only a medical professional if your caregiver is there with you, if you want them to be, So really giving kids lots of power over who touches them, talking about that, talking about the value of saying no, talking about the value of that you will support them even if they say no to a physician, that they can't touch them in some way, and really just, giving them a lot of power around their own body. So it's really wish that I would have emphasized that a little bit more here as the prevention stuff.
Well, it again becomes tricky for foster parents because 11-year-old boy doesn't want to bathe. Dude, you gotta go. You gotta get in the shower. Like I'm gonna put you in the shower. Like you can go in with your clothes in for all I care because you're gonna get something on you. So it does become hard.
Yeah.
It's a dance for foster parents, so just be real smart about the things you do. And again, if you just don't know what to do, call the case manager and ask what you can do. It's okay. Nobody's gonna call you out for that. You also can call your licensing worker for suggestions as well. But it's always good to loop in the case manager and your entire team too.
Great suggestion, thanks. And Derek, does Foster Adopt and Connect have an abuse prevention strategy that they regularly use, or like a packaged curriculum?
Well, of course, it's all part of your initial training as a foster parent. When you went through your STARS class and even your Spalding classes, where they discuss, prevention and things like that. But while kids are still in care, of course, it's what may not seem like abuse or be abuse for one kid may actually be kind of for another kid based on their history,
Yeah.
or what happens or what triggers them. So just like I said, if in doubt, reach out to the case manager or your entire team and say, I'm struggling with this and I need help. So
Okay, great.
uh,
So
all
Derek,
right,
are we supposed to be done in 2 minutes?
I have us actually at 12 minutes. Still,
Okay.
so I think
Okay, great. We're about ready to wrap it up, but I was like, oh my gosh. So I've already kind of talked about this, just keeping the treatment a little bit shorter for the youth with sexual behavior problems. The children, again, in foster care may require more treatment for having been victims of different types of abuse. But the treatment that's specifically for kids with sexual behavior problems, we're looking at 12 to 32 weeks at the max. So.
all right.
Okay.
Oops.
Oh, did
There
I?
we
Okay,
I
great.
got it.
Okay, and again, I've kind of addressed this a little bit, but we used to move towards, including me as a treatment provider, residential or inpatient treatment pretty quickly when a child was acting out sexually because we saw them as being kind of dangerous to themselves or others. And I think we've just gotten smarter about supporting kids and managing their behaviors. And really, unless there's a pretty significant mental health issue in addition to the sexual acting out, kids don't do better in inpatient or residential. They actually do better, when they're left at home. So, yeah.
But again, you got to weigh that as a foster parent. That all has to be weighed against
with the safety of the other kids
the
as
other
well.
kids in your house.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and we've had go through our program, I'd say we've been doing it for about 4 years, and I would say we've had probably 5 kids go to residential, and I think most of them really probably needed to for a variety of different reasons. So definitely a time and a place for it. I do training with Matt McCondo, who's with the Good Samaritan Ranch in southern Missouri, and he works is in charge of their sexually abusive youth program, their SAY program, and I think they just do great work with the kids. And I think kids that would go through his residential program or the residential program down there would be really lucky. But for the most part, we don't want to kind of knee-jerk get kids
Make
out of
them leave home.
Yeah.
Okay. So quick review.
Yeah, so the myths and facts that most kids, I'll say the facts so that'll keep things clear. So about 50% of kids that have sexual behavior problems have experienced sexual abuse themselves. It's unlikely for a child that's experienced sexual abuse to grow up to be a sex offender. Kids that act out sexually are not sex offenders or perpetrators. They're just kids with a behavioral problem that includes some kind of sexual body part or private part usually. And common risk factors for kids are kids that have been witness to domestic violence, have experienced sexual abuse themselves, have experienced a high level of trauma in some way. And the most important thing you can do to reduce the risk of acting out sexually for the youth you are in charge of is just really super high levels of supervision.
Sorry, I had a coughing fit there. Okay.
Oh.
One of those days. Okay. So resources easy to get to.
Yeah, this is a really neat website, www.ncsby.org. And they have, you can see down at the bottom of the tree, the roots for the youth, the parents, and professionals. Just tons of great resources. So more about things that I've said today and then a whole lot more. So if you want to become an expert in the field, go ahead and go to this website and take a look.
Okay.
Okay. That's the book that I was talking about earlier with the different things about normal, red, green, and yellow that Tony Kavanaugh Johnson has spelled out there, and that's our website, which is nice.
Okay.
And then the NASB website also.
Sure. Well, again, for our folks who are viewing this for credit for foster parents in the state of Missouri, if you have any questions, Heather Sake is the keeper of all that is training at Foster Adopt Connect, and she'd be happy to help you if you have any issues or questions. Make sure, though, you might have been laughing at me trying to take all of Renee's quizzes, but now it's your turn because Renee has made you a quiz. But you will need to complete to receive your training credit hours. So make sure to complete the quiz here with the webinar, and upon completion, your certificate will be emailed to you. So complete your quiz, and you'll receive your 2 hours of training credit for Missouri Foster Parent Relicensure. And we certainly appreciate you, Renee, for making that possible for our families. And I think there's a lot of good information. And if they have any follow-up questions and would want to contact you, is that a possibility?
Yeah, absolutely. My number is 816-285-1374. That's my direct number. So I'd love to hear from any of you.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Renee.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. Bye-bye.